Hello and welcome back. In this session, we're going to look at audit planning, and it's quite rare in the ACCA qualification to be able to say that something will definitely be on a paper because usually you can't guarantee that. But I can guarantee you that audit planning will be on your P7 paper, either in the form of a risk assessment or developing the audit plan or looking for items within an audit plan. Those will all be key parts of question one. So it's absolutely crucial that we understand what audit planning is. So I'm going to summarize audit planning, and then I'm going to look at how it's come up in a question, and we're going to develop a plan for that question. So an answer plan, not an audit plan. So we'll develop an answer plan for that question, and then we'll look at how you would fully answer the question and what the examiner expected in terms of the marking scheme and what points they needed you to make. So audit planning, just to summarize briefly what we need to know. The first steps when it comes to audit planning, well, firstly, we need to look at our independence and ethical considerations. It's absolutely crucial for audit planning that we do this. We'll look at ethics later on in the course, but even as an initial point, before we actually accept the engagement, we need to ensure that our independence issues and ethical considerations have been dealt with. So can we actually take on this audit and do it for the client? We also need to consider, do we understand the environment of the entity we're about to audit? We'll look at this in a little more detail when we look at risk assessment, and there are some specific things we need to do to understand the entity, looking at industry and regulations, operations, ownership, governance, policies, objectives, strategies, all those things. But at this stage, we're really thinking about, do we understand the actual engagement, what's required of us? Do we have the knowledge and experience within the firm to actually undertake the engagement? If not, we don't do it. If so, we continue on to the next steps. The next step will involve setting the audit strategy. Remember, the strategy enables us to allocate the resources. It's really the overall scope or direction of the firm. It's not really about the absolute details. At this stage, we'll get more of an understanding of the environment, the legislation and regulations that will affect the organisation. We'll think about deadlines, communications with management, how that will happen. And in terms of the actual engagement, we'll look at materiality, we'll assess the initial risks, and we'll maybe look at the industry a little to see what developments we need to be aware of. Now, crucially, that's not the audit plan, and this is about audit planning. So how do we do that? Well, that's the final stage, really. This is where we set the audit plan. Once we've developed an understanding of the entity, we know we can act through the independence and ethical considerations. This then is the details of how we carry out the audit. The who, what, where, when, why. Who's going to carry out what procedures, where are they going to do them, when are they going to do them, and why are they doing it in terms of what risks they're trying to assess. So this is how we go about planning, and we should understand that at this point. Crucially, you need to understand the difference between the strategy, which is the general scope and direction of the audit, and the plan, which is the details, the who, what, where, when, why of the actual audit to be carried out. Also note that the plan needs to be flexible throughout the audit to deal with unexpected items or unexpected things that may arise. Supervision and review are critical. We'll look at those in more detail when we look at quality control. But know at this stage, in the planning stage, those are things that are very important. And the plan must be documented. it must be put on file, it must be there as evidence, primarily so that the senior auditors can review later on and see, did the plan adequately flow and was it flexible enough to deal with anything that we did discover during the audit. So that's the process in the audit plan. As I said, we may well be asked a question more generally around some of those issues. It may also be that this is the first audit, so I want you to look out for a situation where either this is a new client that has been audited by another auditor previously, or indeed it's a new client that hasn't been audited at all. And each of those throws up its own specific problems. So key things we will need to do here. First of all, we need to contact the previous auditor. Remember that procedure to get professional clearance. We need to ask the client, can we contact the previous auditor? If they refuse, we don't do the audit. We need to then contact the previous auditor. They will ask the client, can they come back to us? And presumably the client says yes. Again, if not, we don't accept the engagement. The previous auditor then comes back to us with information and hopefully even the working papers from the previous audit. So that's the first thing. We'll also then, once we've got them, review the working papers from that previous audit. We'll understand what the accounting policies, etc. are, and we'll see what risks were assessed and how they were dealt with on that previous audit. We'll review that professional clearance process. So we've discussed what it is in terms of contacting the previous auditor, etc. But review that as a test to see, was it done correctly? So once it's done, make sure it was done correctly. Review the opening balances under ACCA 510. So have a look at them. Once again, the working papers from the previous audit will help with that. Where there might be a slight technicality is if there was no previous audit. So this is their first time audit. In that case, you may need to do more detailed testing to get comfort over those opening balances. What we don't want is for there to be a situation where there's some sort of a misstatement in the opening balances that then feeds through into the current year balances that we're auditing. So you'll need to satisfy yourself that those are adequate. Consider previous modifications. Well, as I've just mentioned, if there was a problem previously, it could well have fed forward into this year. So we need to see, has that happened in the past? Will it affect this year? And also, does that shed a different light in the risks that we've identified? Do we now perhaps not trust management as much as we did previously? All of those things will feed into previous modifications. So let's identify whether there were any. Consider also the accounting policies and the treatments that have been carried out. Make sure we agree with them and make sure that they are consistent moving into this year. So look, those are all specific things we might look at if it is our first audit on this client, whether they've had a previous auditor or indeed they maybe haven't been audited at all. Okay, so let's think about how this has actually come up. Let's look at June 15 question 1. We look at part A because it was quite applicable to this area. And firstly, I'm going to show you how I would do an answer plan for this area. So I've said that answer planning is crucial to your P7 mark. Let's look at how we would do it for this particular question. So make sure you have June 15 question 1 in front of you. You might even, in the light of what we've just done, see if you could develop an answer plan first, then work through this with me and see how I develop it. Okay, so we're looking here at question 1 for the June 15 paper, part A specifically. So there's not much in the scenario around this because if you read through the requirement for part A, we're asked to discuss the matters specific to the planning of an initial audit engagement. So that's one of the key bits there. It is an initial audit engagement, which means that it's a new client. So we've already been told that the audit of TED company up here, we're told it's a new client to the firm. And we need to consider what we need to do to develop the audit strategy here. So discuss the matters specific to the planning of an initial audit engagement, which should be considered in developing the audit strategy. Now, the key point on this is that it really is book knowledge, this. It's not related to the scenario. You just need to try to think, okay, what did we learn about that whenever we looked at this area? So in order to plan it, I said that when you're planning, you just want to get thoughts down. You don't want to spend too long developing the plan because it can then eat into the time that you've got to actually answer the question. But we want to get some notes here that we would think about when we're planning an initial audit engagement. So what will we do? Well, remember, you've got to do the contacting the previous auditor. So you've got to go through all of that, getting clearance, professional clearance. When we do that, we will look at getting the working papers from the previous auditor. So we'll think about the working papers. We also might think about what the risks are. So specifically for a new client, we'll be worried about the opening balances. So are we convinced that everything's okay in there? What could be a problem? Well, maybe they had a previous modification. So we'd need to check and see, is there any way that they could have had a previous modification on an audit and that would have fed through to the opening balances? So we'll need to check that. You could even think about, what about our procedures for taking on the new client? Should you review those quality control procedures and see what it is that maybe has been done when we got this client? All of those will be things that we'll need to consider. Now, looking at the marks here, we've got 6 marks, and I pretty much already got 6 key points that I would want to make here. Thinking about that, are there any that are more important? Well, the clearance procedures, the opening balance, and reviewing the previous working papers will be the key ones. So I'd maybe start with those and then try to think of the other ones as we go. It's 6 marks though, so we'll know broadly we'll need to come up with 6 relevant items and discuss them. So what I would now do is, taking those key points, use each of those as a heading or each of those as basically a paragraph, and that would form the bones of the answer that we're going to actually put on paper for the examiner. So that's what we'll do next. We'll look at how we might actually use those to develop, and we'll look at the marking scheme to see where you would actually get your marks for this. Now that we've seen how to develop an answer plan, let's look at the actual answer. So what I'll do here is I'll look at the actual requirements in the answer scheme. It's really quite crucial for P7 that you get to grips with the answers that the examiner provides. I'm not particularly thinking about the long actual answers. I'm more thinking about the answer scheme, the marking scheme at the back of the answer booklet. That will tell us exactly what the marks were for and will enable you to see, did you identify the key points? It's up to us then to say, okay, if we'd identified these key points, how did we then fully develop them into an actual paragraph for our answer? What is the examiner looking for in terms of length of paragraph? How much do I need to write to get the marks? So we'll look at what we would write for some of those, maybe not all of them because there's a lot, because the examiner covers more than is required to pick up all of the marks. but we'll look at least some of them and see how would we develop that into a full answer. Okay, so we're looking here at June 15, question 1, part A. We're looking at the actual answer, how we would have developed it. We've done an answer plan, and what I want to do is look at the marking scheme, because that's really where the detail is as to where you're going to get your marks here. So the marking scheme says for initial audit engagement that we have, we're going to get generally up to 1.5 marks for each point discussed. So it then gives us a list of things we could discuss, which broadly, if you're doing this correctly, you should be aiming that your your answer plan that you've done identifies all of these points. The answer plan identifies them. We then develop it into a paragraph for our full answer. So for example, the first one was communicate with the previous auditor and review their working papers. So 1.5 marks for discussing that. Now, if you just wrote that, sometimes students come out of the P7 exam and think, well, I've identified all the correct things here. I put down we should communicate with the previous auditor and review their working papers. That will not get you the marks. It won't even get you half marks. You have got to tell the examiner why you would do that. So you need to build upon your initial thought to say, right, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is why we're going to do it. So for example, for this you might write something like, it's important, given that this is an initial audit engagement, that we carry out specific audit procedures to minimise risk. We should start by contacting the previous auditor to request the initial working papers for the financial year 31st of May 14. That's last year. This will enable us to more effectively plan the audit by highlighting any potential problems in the opening balances or in the understanding of the appropriateness of accounting policies applied. So probably a little bit more in there than strictly required, but that's what we're talking about. That explains that we're going to communicate with the previous auditor. Why we're doing that? Because it's an initial audit engagement. And we're going to review their working papers. Why are we going to do that? Well, to efficiently plan the audit by highlighting potential problems in opening balances or appropriateness of accounting policies. That is a full answer, not just identifying the issue, but going on to fully explain it. And far too many students come out of the exam thinking that they've got basically full marks because they've identified all of the issues, but getting very, very little marks. I mean, it's very possible to identify all the correct issues and get maybe 20% of the marks, which is very disheartening if you don't understand that you needed to fully explain your answer. And you go home after you get your result and think, but I got all of those points. Maybe you did, but you didn't fully explain them. So the next point was that we should consider whether any previous audit reports were modified. Once again, if you identified it, that's only the first step. We need to be saying something like this. In addition to the above, it will be important as part of our initial risk assessment to inquire as to whether of the previous audit reports have been modified. A previous modification will indicate an increased level of risk of misstatement, and we would need to ensure the problem was rectified. Now that fully explains why we would need to look at the previous audit reports to see if they're modified. So identifying it, as we can see here, is only the first step. We need to take that second step. Or the next one, consider any matters that were raised when the professional clearance was obtained. So maybe when we actually looked at the professional clearance, the other auditor, the previous auditor, identified something that we should be looking at. So as part of the client acceptance process, professional clearance should have been sought from Crilly & Co. Any matters which were brought to our firm's attention when professional clearance was obtained should be considered for their potential impact on the audit strategy. Okay, so 1.5 marks for each point discussed. Well, look at that. We've got 3 points so far. We're definitely going to get 1.5 for each of those. So we've passed the question already. We've already got our 4.5, good, pass. It didn't matter if we went on to get these others. So not saying what we'd have said in the full paragraph, just what should we have identified here in our answer plan. Consider matters discussed with management during our firm's appointment. Well, we want to do that in order to fully understand the risks and in order to make sure that we guide our audit in the correct manner. The need to develop thorough business understanding. We mentioned that in the session. We need to understand the entity, the legislation, the regulations, etc., so that we can identify better the risks. The risk of misstatement in the opening balance and previously applied accounting policies, both of which we mentioned. Remember, we don't want the opening balances to have a misstatement feeding through into this year, because that would then have an impact on our audit. There'd be a misstatement in the balance that we have currently. Firm's quality control procedures we mentioned. We said that we need to ensure that those were applied, particularly in the clearance procedure whenever we were obtaining that professional clearance. Lastly, need to use an experienced audit team to reduce detection risk. Don't think we mentioned that in our plan, but you could have said that. You could have said, look, if we have an experienced team that understands this area of the business, that understands this particular client, well, then we need to use them to reduce our detection risk. So remember, the maximum marks here were 6, 1.5 for each point discussed. And what I want you to start to understand is when you're looking at the examiner's answer, you can read through the big actual answer to try to understand the areas that the examiner has examined. But when you're actually marking your paper, you need to go to the marking scheme and you need to see what actual points the marks were for. And if you didn't fully explain it, if you didn't say why it was an issue and fully explain how it would impact on the audit, well, then you're not going to get 1.5 marks. As I said, if you had put the exact wording of the examiner, i.e. communicate with previous auditor, review their working papers, I would say you'd probably get a 0.5 mark out of 1.5, which is 33%, not enough to pass the paper. So work on building your answer around the points that you've identified in your audit plan. As we've seen here, we only really needed to fully explain 3 of these to pass, 4 of them to get full marks. So it's not difficult, yet students continue to get very poor marks, particularly because they don't understand that it's not about identifying the issues, it's about fully explaining them. So let's practice that as we go through future questions.